Welcome. My name is Peter Feaver, and I am the shaggy-haired director of the American Grand Strategy Program. And I'm so glad you came to join us for this, our first AGS event after exam week. This is a first for us, and we're just so grateful that so many of you joined. It's not the last event of the year. Believe it or not, next week on May 12th, we'll be co-sponsoring an event looking at surveillance and security in an age of COVID with our own David Hoffman, David Shanzer, Professor Dellinger, Professor Stansbury, four Duke experts looking at the issues of surveillance and security and how to maintain privacy rights in the new era. And that'll be May 12th at 5:30, and I heartily recommend it to you. But of course, you came to hear one of an AGS favorite, Paul Teller, a great Duke alum who has worked in government for several decades now and currently works at the White House as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Vice President's office. Welcome, Paul. It's great to have you back.
Great to be here. I appreciate you having me.
Well, and so my question, if you can remember, this is Tuesday, May 5th, the week before commencement week. It used to be called Myrtle Beach Week.
Oh, yes.
Remember what you were doing in this week of '93, your graduation year?
You know, this has to be a PG rated thing, so I probably can't describe what we were doing in Myrtle. But no, we actually, that's exactly where we were. And I see some of my fellow 93ers are on this call, and I'm very grateful for that. So they know what I'm talking about. But no, we missed those days, and I'm sure the current Duke students are just heartbroken over not being able to be there as well.
Well, we're going to do a commencement, remote learning, online commencement special thing this Sunday. And we're very proud of our Duke commencement speaker, who you may have seen. Did you see who that was?
I actually didn't see who that was.
Oh, so it's the actor, Chung, Kevin Chung. And it was going to be one of the great commencement talks of all Duke history, but it'll have to be done online, and then there'll be some kind of in-person thing later. But what I hear you saying is that on a Tuesday night of that week, you were not Zooming in to hear from a senior public servant about life in Washington, D.C.
That is 100% certain. That's right.
We've got a lot of serious-minded people on the call, and let's not disappoint them. So tell me a little bit about what the title Deputy Assistant to the President means, and particularly what the Director of Strategic Initiatives does in the Vice President's office. Just what's your role?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I appreciate it. Yeah, the key part of the title is that second part, the strategic initiatives part. That's basically my day-to-day, where that's just a fancy title for outreach to the conservative world. As you probably know from my bio and stuff, that's kind of all I've ever done is outreach to the conservative world, either work for or reach out to, mostly on Capitol Hill. But then at the White House, I was in legislative affairs for 3 years, working again with the most conservative members of the House and Senate, and now working in the Vice President's office to kind of the conservative world writ large, on the Hill, advocacy groups, taxpayer groups, even state legislators, students, whatever comes under that header. So it's a great honor. It's been a lot of fun so far.
Now, you took this job just in March, which is about the time that that's a coincidence, right? It wasn't you getting this job plunged the country into this crisis, but that obviously changes the way you interact with people. Are you just living on Zoom and phone calls, or how are you able to do your job?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because you're right. As an outreach guy, it's you want to be in person with folks, right? You want to see them, you want to talk to them, you want to have lunch with them, or go to their conferences, or just overhear, frankly, conversations in the hallway, right? Just walk down and see who's talking to who, and any of those things. Those intangibles obviously have gone away. So yeah, there's a lot of Zooms or equivalent. There's different kind of platforms out there. conference calls, texts, emails. You're just, trying to do what you can to stay in touch and still reach out best you can and learn from folks and hear, because it's supposed to be, my job is very two-way. It's not just coming down to say, here's what the White House thinks, please get in line. Not at all. It's very much a lot of open ears. What do you think? What should we do? What are we hearing? Things along those lines. And frankly, it's almost been never more important than now to listen, right? A lot of us who are in Washington, for good reason, are kind of stuck in Washington. And so we need to be listening to people who are either outside the Beltway or regularly talking to people who are outside the Beltway. So the listening part of the job has gotten even more important. And so I just try to constantly just hear opinions, hear stories, learn about industries I would have never thought I would be learning about. I was talking on the phone last week with a very large pig farmer in Nebraska, right? And
it's a big issue now. It's a
very Jewish guy from Long Island. It was definitely a conversation I didn't expect to have, but it was fantastic in the sense that I learned a lot, and it was interesting to hear what folks in that particular industry are fearful about, right? And what they need to get back into normal life. So it's been a challenge, but also rewarding.
Well, in a moment, I want to talk to you about some of those things you might be hearing. But first, just give us a little bit more of a color. Are you working from home now? Do you guys go swap in and out? We watch the president's press conference every day, so we have a view of just that little snapshot into the West Wing operations. But tell us a little bit more what the big White House feels like these days.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah, most of us have been teleworking for weeks. At different levels, right? Obviously, the people who have to deal with the immediate movements of the president or vice president, those folks have been going in, right? The folks who just get them from one place to the other, scheduling, those kind of folks. Others go in from time to time as needed, but again, a guy like me is, doing things remotely anyway, because the folks that I interface with are not themselves meeting in person. So there's not been a tremendous amount of reason for me to physically go in. So yeah, I've been teleworking for the last 6-7 weeks, except for today. I did go in for today. We, I thought I'd just put the toe in the water a little bit.
Remind them that you work for them, just in case they.
Yeah, that's right. My desk has been replaced with somebody else. But yeah, went in just for basically 2 hours today or so. Checked a few things. Literally, a few things had fallen off the walls that I apparently had not properly taped up to the wall. So it did look like things were falling apart. But the it was good. We had.
And do you have to be checked? Have your temperature checked to even enter the compound?
Yep, temperature. One of those. I don't even know how they figured this out, but one of those things they put right up to your forehead, and 3 seconds later, they clear you in, that kind of thing. So not everybody's been tested though. We're working on that for the. It has to do with whether you're right around the president and the vice president. Since I haven't been for the last 6-7 weeks, I haven't gotten a test, but I would imagine that's coming soon.
Wow. And can you just describe a little bit the mood? I imagine, this is being described as one of the greatest challenges the country's faced in our lifetime. And so to be in that position of influence, the mood must be electric in some ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a balance, right? Because yes, in one sense, right, you realize the gravity of what you're doing, and but you also realize just how many people are hurting, are dying, are suffering, struggling, whatever the word is, of your preference. And so you balance those feelings of, hey, this is I'm privileged to be here in this job in this moment, with knowing, what's going on. And many of us have been touched by it either personally or know someone who's been touched by it personally. And of course, then you just hear the stories and you see the aggregate data. So yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking, but that heartbreak also gives you, energy to say, we've got to solve this. We've got to get through this. So it's rewarding, but it's a tough balance.
So let me push you a little bit harder now on your specific portfolio, which before it was Ledge Affairs, and now it's strategic initiatives, but what an incredible time to be doing ledge affairs and outreach. Even before the pandemic, you had the impeachment.
Yeah.
And before that, you had the Mueller investigation, and it felt something like a pitched battle between both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. So, can you describe a little bit the challenges you faced in these different posts when it feels like, from our remove, it feels like the two branches of government are not working well together?
Yeah, I guess there are moments when collaboration is a little lacking. I guess maybe that's a nice way to say it. I would say that's probably still ongoing, right? Congress and the executive branch are not always the best of friends. And as you know, it was constitutionally designed that way. So no one should be shocked, right? That each branch is kind of pushing for its turf. And of course, within the legislative branch, you've got the further battle of Republican Senate, Democrat House. And so that's, you know, that brings challenges right there. And on top of that, then you throw in just kind of the added layer of the election year, right, which makes everything seem that much more heightened and important. And folks are digging in, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's an ongoing challenge. The good news is, I do think there is some agreement between the parties and between the branches that America can stay like this very much longer, right? Is there anyone out there saying, let's do this just as is for the next year or so? I think folks are saying we may disagree on who, how, when, and where, that kind of thing. And I'm sure we'll talk about that tonight. But in terms of the goal of let's get through this in some way, that's bringing folks together to, you know, cause some action.
Well, yeah, and if you want to look at it a glass half full kind of way, you could say 2 months ago, I would have bet you $100 that you would not get Congress to spend a $1 trillion, to pass a $1 trillion, $2 trillion spending bill. This is not possible. That was not deemed possible, and yet you all did it in a very short period of time, which I think attests to the seriousness with which everyone felt the crisis was. So I accept that point. That said, there's a lot of research that you've seen, I'm sure, about how people seem to be experiencing different crises based on their political ideology, that people are afraid of different things, they believe different statistics about death rates, et cetera. Just the division that the country had before the crisis seems to be persisting and shaping it in the crisis. Are you experiencing that? Do you find very different topics of, or not topics, but content in the conversation when, depending on the audience you're talking to?
Yeah, I think very much so. Frankly, even just in my personal life, if I'm talking to folks, you know, more left of center, they're in general, and again, this is a huge generalization, but in general, they seem to be more skeptical of the reopening at this time. The states that are going maybe a little faster, they're more skeptical of. Talk to folks, either friends or colleagues right of center, they seem to be pushing for even faster reopening. And you know, why is it going as slowly as it is? That kind of thing. It even breaks down to therapeutics or reported therapeutics that are out there, right? And like, again, huge generalization, but a lot of times you hear left of center folks not as trustworthy of some of the reported therapeutics, like this hydroxychloroquine that's been talked about a lot. Right of center folks much more willing to either give it a try themselves, I've heard that, or prescribe it if they're a right of center doctor, or just say, hey, why is the FDA not kind of full-throatedly endorsed this therapeutic yet? So yeah, you're right. The politics do break down even in those metrics.
So, but in a crisis like this is often the time when presidents, even very partisan presidents, sort of rise above it and become the president of everybody. I'm thinking of George W. Bush, strongly reviled on September 10th, and then enjoying something like a statesman-like status in the aftermath of 9/11 for a while, at least until the Iraq War, where even people on the other side of the aisle seem to be crediting him with leadership. we see less of that this time around, and I'm just wondering, from the White House's perspective, what explains that?
It's a great point. And I'm not sure I have much of an answer for you other than it's possible some of the 24-hour news cycle, social media fuels some of those flames and maybe makes it harder to kind of to unify. I'm guessing. Again, I'm not totally sure of the answer of that, but you're right to observe that. Frankly, you even see it in some of the press briefings, right? You can't imagine some of the questions that the president gets now being given to, frankly, any previous president, certainly during a crisis. But I'm sure there's more to it than that. But I don't know that I have your full answer. I apologize.
Well, I I realize that you serve at the pleasure of the president. I'm not trying to create a displeasure. So, but I'll push you just a little bit, which is
Okay.
um, how much of that can be laid at the president's style? You know, he has a very unorthodox style, which is part of his stock and trade and how he got elected. You know, he was not like every other president. But then some of the things that every other president does might be what contributes to this, you know, ability to rise above type thing. Is that a fair uh, hypothesis?
Yeah, it could be, right? Because you're right to say that some of that style that you talk about uh, does seem to be very divisive for folks, right? It's what most attracts folks to him, but right, it does turn off a good number of folks. Even again, going back to my personal life and more liberal friends and relatives, especially up north, I hear that a lot, as you can imagine. You hear a lot about the tone and less about the substance, which is interesting. And so that's very possible.
Uh, Now, the person you work directly for, the vice president, has played really an outsized role. I would say this has been the most high profile thing he's done as vice president, is his role in this crisis. Is that fair, or am I forgetting something big he did in the first 3 years?
Yeah, no, I think there have been other things, but yeah, it's hard to imagine this being top plane. I think you're right. Yeah.
And his style is just very different than the president. So, how would you describe the vice president's style in, his demeanor, or even in the way he tries to answer questions and things?
I mean, he's somebody that I wish I could be more like in the sense that, he just cool, calm, and collected no matter what, right? It just doesn't matter what's coming at him. And he's just the most even keeled guy. And he's the same way behind the scenes. I actually worked for him back in, when was it, 2005, 2006. He was the chairman of the RSC, the Republican Study Committee, one of the conservative caucuses in the U.S. House. And he was one of the chairmen I worked for back then. He has changed a bit. And I mean that as a compliment. I mean, he's been consistently even keeled for all those years. And it's amazing. I think that's maybe what folks are really admiring, is despite what's coming at him, the tragedy around America, or again, even just tough questions in press briefings, and just even keeled, always one breath away from a reassuring response. And I think it's going to be a lasting impact for him.
One imagines that, the strain at times must be great. You know that the video cameras often zero in on his face,
Oh, yeah.
just to try to catch the slightest flinch. And to those of us watching on TV, we imagine that he sort of makes it through to the end, gets back to his office, and then looks for his first Paul Teller staffer and just chews him out just to get the strain out. Is that what happens behind closed doors? Like kind of an outburst of pent up emotion?
It really doesn't. It's amazing. Like I said, it's an amazing talent, because I think
Yeah.
all of us on this Zoom are maybe prone to do some of that at some point, but he really doesn't. I mean, it's an amazing talent. And again, this is not just me saying that because I work for him currently. Worked for him, 15 or so years ago, and stayed in touch and collaborated with him in different capacities since then. So I've known the man for a while, and he no, it's an amazing talent that he's got to stay even keeled, and so respectful of people, a fantastic listener, and just really perfect for this time.
I thought he definitely did um, one thing which we don't always see from the White House, and that is admit that he had made a mistake. So on the mask wearing at the Mayo Clinic,
Right.
at least what I recall hearing him say next day is, maybe I should have worn the mask.
Yeah.
Of course, he was given an out by his wife, and when your wife corrects you, that gives you the obligation to correct yourself. But he did that, and then that issue went away. So there is a sense in American politics where if you just say, I made a mistake on that, then the issue goes away. But where if you try to pretend that there wasn't a mistake, then the issue persists.
Right. No, that's right. Yeah, I think it was from forgetting which show, but yeah, one of the Sunday shows where he did say, yeah, that he regrets not doing that, and at events since then, travels and things like that, he's worn masks. So, like you said, I think we've gotten over that.
Yeah. Well, I could ask you then, why doesn't other people in the White House admit that they've made a mistake? But I won't ask you that that question. Instead, I think I know what your email and phone lines were like the week before Easter, the weekend before Easter, because my friends who talked to me and also talked to you were livid with the shutdown and believing that the president had made a big mistake. And I'm guessing that these were some of your core people that you talked to. And so talk a little bit about that. This was the biggest break I've witnessed between this core group of supporters of the president and the president. They've been with him through many, many other challenges, but on this one, a lot of the president's base thought the president needed to shift to opening the country earlier, and this is now a month ago. So can you talk a little bit about that pressure?
Absolutely. And frankly, that kind of thing that you're talking about, that's my everyday. These are the folks I collaborate with and connect with, liaison with every single day. Love them. These are brothers and sisters. But yeah, they beat me up just about every day about something, one thing or the other. And right, that week before Easter was maybe a spike in the beating up of me and others here in the White House. Because yeah, some are frustrated that we're not that we're not doing more to reopen quicker. I think now that you've seen the reopening guidelines, that has let some of the steam out of the pot for sure. But the one thing, and again, this is a blessing of the job too, but you hear so many opinions from different parts of the country, right? In other words, when I did a Zoom with a cousin of mine in Manhattan whose husband is a radiologist in a big New York hospital, you're going to hear a very different perspective, right, than talking to an ally, in a rural area in the Midwest where there are very few cases. So you're hearing those perspectives and trying to jive those. And I think, frankly, the way that this administration has jived those, if you will, is by not saying there's a one-size-fits-all solution, right? And that's been interesting, too, is resisting pressure, mostly from, left of center forces, but frankly, also from some right of center folks saying that there should just be national solutions to these things, as opposed to letting governors, states, localities, counties make the decisions based off of the realities on the ground where they are and they know best, kind of thing. So that's been a way we've talked about it too, is the importance of federalism, small f, getting the states and localities to make those core decisions based on what they know best.
So what I heard was also just despair from some of the president's supporters who thought that he was putting in jeopardy his reelection, which had hinged on a strong economy, but that the shutdown was going to create the high unemployment numbers we've seen. And so he was in a hole and digging, was the way they put it. How did you answer those criticisms, and how do you answer those criticisms?
Right. I mean, frankly, just by what we were saying before, being a good listening ear, just taking the input, synthesizing it as much as we can. I do a daily report for the vice president, which he seems to appreciate. I don't know what he would say if he was on this Zoom, but the impression I get is he appreciates it. Again, that tries to synthesize those different opinions from, in my case, around the conservative world, but other parts as well that I can hear, and just again trying to focus on what we are doing, what the guidelines for reopening, and I think by focusing on that, that we're no longer just kind of what we heard the most criticism on was some of those press briefings were just all about the gloom and doom. That was, I think, the number one criticism we heard. It was that it should include that. Obviously, people are dying and hurting and things like that. But isn't there good news to report as well? And that started to come into more of the press briefings. And the good news being the number of people who've recovered, the number of people who've tested negative, the number of people with no symptoms or very light symptoms. The fact that it seems to be regional, which is not good for those regions where it's been hardest hit, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, et cetera, but meaning that it's not necessarily going to be an outbreak in every county in America. That was good news. Things like that. So we tried to, focus on bringing some of the good with the bad.
So Jared Kushner earlier this week said that he thought, that by and large history would grade the federal government response very positively. And you got some pushback, as you can imagine, in the media on that. What do you think is the one or two things you'd point to say, yeah, if you want to give us a high grade, you could give us a high grade on this? What do you think the federal government has done the best? And what's coming next is what you did less well. But first, what's the good news that you try to lead with?
No, I feel like you'd mention that as well. But yeah, I think what I would say for folks is that we've, just going back to frankly what we were just saying, not having a one size fits all solution. I think, and it's hard to see it when they're in the midst of this, but when we're, God willing, out of this and looking back, I think we're going to really say that was a huge strength, that it wasn't just kind of telling every state, every locality, you must do this now or else. And I think that's going to be looked on as a big success. I think another big success that we've been touting is how deregulation or relaxing of certain regulations in the healthcare sphere, frankly, even in the transportation sphere and other such spheres, have really helped get things to people quicker, whether it be medical solutions or, again, protective equipment, things along those lines. I think that's going to be a success story as well, that when you take government as much as possible out of the roadblocks between getting a product or service to market, to a person, to a hospital, wherever it's going, that's a win. And I think that's something that folks will look back on and say, yeah, good job. That was something that we spearheaded and didn't take on the usual approach. It was a Wall Street Journal piece I would commend to you. I think Chris DeMuth was the author of that, and just really digs in how this is the first crisis in all of U.S. history where the response has been less regulation, less government, deregulation, federalism, letting the states and localities rule. And I think that's going to be a big success story. Okay, what have we not done as well? Okay, what can I say without getting in trouble on an on-the-record recorded Zoom, right? What have we not done as well? Well, I think, this I think is something we can all agree on. Certainly in the beginning, I don't know that we communicated as well what we were doing. The reason I say that is because some folks still are saying we didn't start early enough. But then when we show them the actual timeline of what we were doing, you see those same folks go, well, okay, I guess you did start earlier than I thought. So that's on us for not telling the story, for not communicating exactly what was going on and when, and maybe we were distracted by other things at the time. So that's probably something we'll have to learn from in the future, that you have to tell your story, tell your timeline as it's going, right? Don't assume it's going to be told by others. Well,
and these are my words, not yours, but the way I would put that is that the message was not consistent in the early days in particular. So some of the pushback you get from, if you show a timeline, is they say, okay, yeah, that might have been happening. Matt Pottinger might have been doing that, but here's the tweet that, came out, or here's what someone said from the podium. and it's a very different story. And so the messages didn't align until late March, I would say.
And I think some of that has to do with just not knowing, right, what we really were facing, right? If you think back, if all of us on the Zoom think back to how we felt about this in January, February even, most of us, kind of thinking it was something for somewhere else, or even once it hit America's shores, very limited, right? A couple of nursing homes. I think a lot of folks, it didn't really sink in how serious this was for a long time. And maybe that contributed to some of the early messaging inconsistencies that could be.
So just in case the audience does not know about this, I want to ask you to explain briefly the Hatch Act and how that affects your job, because you mentioned we're in a re-election year, so of course the president is running the country and also running for re-election, and he has a staff, some of whom are helping him run the country, and the others are helping him run for re-election. So describe how those two things work together.
Yeah, no, and thank you for saying that, because there really is that strict wall between the two, the official side, the campaign side. I'm on the official side, the government side, the taxpayer side, which means I can't do the campaign stuff. I'm at a level where I'm allowed to do it if, off government property, off government equipment. I can't use a government phone or a laptop to do anything like that. So I could do stuff on the side, but frankly, maybe that'll come as we get closer. But right now, it's obviously all COVID response all the time. President, vice president have a big enough campaign staff. They don't need one extra guy, playing on his phone at night in his kitchen. But yeah, we're constantly reminded by lawyers in the White House and elsewhere, keep that line. Don't do campaign type stuff. So and we were even talking about this before the Zoom started, even speculating on campaign stuff, I try not to do, because in the case it might step, improperly into that arena, it's easier to just avoid it.
So I hope I'm not pushing you to speculate, but it is the case that the president's reelection chances probably rise or fall with how fast the economy recovers from this. That if he gets the V recovery, that's a very different scenario in October than if it's a hockey stick. So if that's the case, how can you reassure people that is not shaping the calculation that the government is making about all these decisions? He wants to do what's right for the country, but he also wants to get reelected. Those may be in tension at times.
Yeah, but I can assure you, President, Vice President, really everybody there at the White House, we're just focused on getting through this so that we could stop the death, right? There's horrible numbers of deaths that are happening, sickness, illness, fear, right? Just the fear of it. Even if you don't have it, may not ever get it, just worrying about it. That's not America, right? That's not what we want to be as a country. So we really do want to get through this and get back to where things were, right? A soaring, booming economy, leadership in the world stage, things like that. And that's really what's got us focused. I assure you, we're not sitting around saying, like, all right, how does it look for November, first week in November? That seems light years from now. It's if anything, it's hard to even envision what next week looks like, because each day has been, so packed, so intense, and things change so much in terms of just what Americans are thinking and feeling, what they're comfortable with, and in this case now, what the reopening guidelines are doing. Are folks following them? Are they not following them? Why? What could we do to encourage them to follow those guidelines?
On that particular issue, the president criticized Governor Kemp, a Republican ally, for maybe going faster than he wanted. Did you get pushback from your community when the president, apparently did a brushback pitch on a major state, a Republican state?
it's similar to what we talked about before. There are always folks in the conservative world that I love and work with who, if we were going at warp speed, they'd want us to go warp, +1, that kind of thing. So yeah, but again, that's not specific to the Georgia governor or anything else. That's an ongoing thing we hear. And there's some validity to that, right? There are certain areas where there's just very few cases and folks are wondering why are things still shuttered. Or actually what we heard a lot of was some of the inconsistencies in what was closed, right? That's a very common refrain that I would hear. It's like either, all open or all closed, or if you're going to do something in between, explain to us why certain, you could buy a certain product at a certain store, but that same product you couldn't buy at another store down the street because that one was closed. Things like that, you heard the example in Michigan, right? A lot of you couldn't drive to your own vacation home if it was, let's say, in the UP, the Upper Peninsula. You couldn't buy paint at certain stores. You couldn't be out on your own boat miles from anyone else on a lake. Yet you could still, buy a lottery ticket. That was the common thing that was referred to. So, we heard a lot about the inconsistencies, and I think we still hear that as the reopenings happen in, in different ways in different states.
So I got a couple folks asked me to ask you some good questions. So let me ask one of them now.
Okay.
Mary Beth pointed out that the vice president just announced a phasing out of the task force, which feels a little premature, that we're not out of the woods yet. And I think a lot of Americans have actually found some reassurance from Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci. They've been quite effective as leaders and as messengers. So are you concerned that the task force is being phased out too soon before we get out of the woods?
Well, I'll admit that I haven't, because that's relatively new news, I haven't had time to kind of check with, do my gut check around the conservative world on that to hear what the opinions are. From inside, though, I know that the task force, at least from what I understand, will be in place through all or most of May. And at that point, it's not like the folks you're used to seeing in the press briefings, suddenly drop off the planet. They just may, instead of kind of having a beachhead at the White House, their beachhead may just move back to their respective agencies. So they're very much still going to be working to get us through this and help guide the states that ask for help and things like that.
Mm-hmm. You touted when you said things that you think the administration did well in response was the deregulation. And some of that, of course, was emergency, just telemedicine and things like that. In a crisis, we're not going to crack down. But Harrison put in a great question. He says, once people get a taste of that, they're going to want to keep it. And so can you think of some deregulatory moves that were maybe made in a crisis moment, but that are going to become permanent or indefinite? Let's put it that way.
Good question. That's something we're discussing now, not only internally, in the White House, but, with friends in Congress, whether there should be legislation to try to make permanent some of the deregulation. We're hearing a lot of that, as you can imagine. A conservative outreach guy hears a lot about deregulation. Normally, now it's big time, because folks are saying, especially perfect example with pharmaceuticals, right? Like, why should there be such a long period to get something to market or to let people try it if they want to try it in an emergency of their own, what they deem as an emergency. So, in some of the logistical hurdles, right, that got some PPE, personal protective equipment, to hospitals quicker than normal. Why, in other words, why do we require a mass emergency for that? Because for any one person who needs that pharmaceutical or that personal protective equipment, it's an emergency for that person, right? And so
Right.
those relaxed or accelerated rules exist all the time. TBD, discussing it, looking at the options, but that's something that's real serious. And I think that's something that we could use to reach across the aisle with. That's something that we've seen some polling on that shows left, right, and center support the notion of making some of these things easier to develop, get to market, get to the patient, get to the doctor, et cetera, et cetera.
Speaking of reaching across the aisle, something that the other party wants, the Democrats want, that the White House has been unwilling to give them is IG oversight of the trillions of dollars that are being spent. Don't you think that would have been a compromise that should be given? Certainly, if this was the Obama administration handing out all this money, your former caucus would have wanted to look where that money was going, right? So why was that one blocked?
And look, I think that's something, to be honest, that's still being considered because of the point you just made. I would be remiss in saying that, yeah, that's not being discussed at how the optics look at what you just mentioned. So perhaps expect to see more of that coming.
Okay, well, we got some. I want to shift a little bit now to some student questions,
Okay.
including eventually we're going to get to someone from the class of '93.
Fantastic.
And if that person has photos to share, we'll do a screen sharing so
Oh
that
boy.
But first, Dora is going to be up first, and so Dora will turn on your mic so you can ask Paul Teller your question. Dora? Dora, are you there? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hi,
Go ahead.
thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to speak with us today. My question concerns COVID-19 testing.
Mm-hmm.
So given that many individuals who test positive for COVID are actually asymptomatic, for example, at the Triumph meatpacking plant in Missouri, where almost 400 employees who were instructed to return to work were tested and then found that they were positive and they had absolutely zero symptoms. And even a few days ago, the Capitol physician announced that there weren't enough resources to test all 100 members of the US Senate. How exactly is the White House planning to phase out reopening without any testing capabilities at this point?
Great question. Yeah, that's why I think the testing is so critical. We realize that that's what folks are requiring, not from a medical perspective alone, but frankly, even psychological, right? If you test and make it negative, you'll feel better about being returning to society, returning to the economy, that kind of thing. And so we just recently put out that national testing blueprint. If you haven't seen it, can get it to you or get it to Dr. Feaver. He can circulate it. But it basically talks about, and it goes to some of the deregulation we were talking about before, but accelerated plans using federal, state and local, and the private sector kind of collaborative efforts with each doing its own part. And again, going to similar to what we were saying before, the federal government wouldn't do the testing itself, but help be a strategic guider, an overseer, a facilitator. States and localities partnering with the private sector could work to get these tests up and running and distributed to hotspots, especially in the priority areas, vulnerable populations, especially key industries that I think folks would agree we want to make sure stay online, stay operational, or get back operational, things along those lines. But what we can do from the federal side really is just make sure we're as fast as possible helping approve those testing regimes. I think there have been 70 or so, 70, maybe more at this point, different tests approved. And most of those for the virus, but some for the antibodies as well, which I know will be an important next step for recovery. So a lot more to do, but also a lot has been done at record pace.
Rahul is next. Rahul?
Thank you so much. I think, as you said earlier, with regards to the domestic response, we've seen great confidence in the task force with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. But with regards to American global leadership on the coronavirus, we saw the administration recently cut its funding to the World Health Organization, of which we're the biggest contributor, as well as declined to participate in the recent European funding and intellectual property sharing effort to develop a vaccine. So my question is, isn't it possible that these actions might actually hinder our recovery from the coronavirus, since the WHO's global disease prevention efforts will be weakened and it could possibly take longer to develop a vaccine due to duplication and things like that?
Interesting. Well, that's certainly one perspective, right? There's a lot of folks hearing her saying that. Other folks, of course, are pointing to the fact that the World Health Organization parroted the Chinese talking points early on, said that it wasn't transmitted human to human, and other things that you would think would, for a World Health Organization, would have never said, and probably cost folks some time and therefore lives. So yeah, that's, I wouldn't imagine the WHO is a body we'll look to with great trust and anytime soon. So our view is the best way to really get the solution is through private sector innovation, partnering with states and localities for knowing where and when, and getting those things to market.
So let me just pile on for a second, though. The other area here is the competition with China. And you mentioned things that the WHO did early on that that may have been favoring China. But what the administration's move was not well received in the international community, and it seemed to create an opportunity for China to score points against the United States and be seen as more of a public goods-minded international leader. So I wonder if there wasn't, if the China competition angle wouldn't have wanted the president to lead the WHO, sort of to take over and lead it in a better direction rather than to cut it loose.
Something to consider, but you can imagine kind of in the middle of all this.
Right.
Yeah.
Likely not what you're hearing from your primary audience, but I'm just, when you come to Duke, these are the kind of great ideas you hear. So when you come to Duke, you also meet class of '93 folks like a guy named Del Reniger. I don't know if that's an old name for you, but he has a question for you, Del.
Excellent.
Hey, Paul. First, thanks for doing this. I was a veteran of the George Bush White House and did similar events, and you're doing this with grace. So thank you for doing it. The question I have for you is about the Defense Production Act. As you know, we hosted Vice President Pence at the GE facility in Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago, but there obviously was, I think, perhaps some reluctance in conservative circles to invoke something like the Defense Production Act. On the one hand, it's been great to help our supply chain produce more for an urgent need, but in the hands of protectionists and other people who don't necessarily have true conservative values, it could be quite dangerous. So I'd just love to hear what process you went through and your reaction to the Defense Production Act.
Fantastic. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a great point. And you're right. It's something, your liaison with the conservative world, you hear a lot about the Defense Production Act. And for those who, not as familiar with it, that's basically just the law from, I guess, the 1950s that essentially allows the federal government to take over certain parts of the economy, and pretty large parts of the economy if need be, if justified in a wartime setting. And so what I think we could point to is how this president, this administration have used a very light touch to the Defense Production Act. In other words, there was tremendous pressure for him for the president to take over much larger parts of the economy, entire industries, entire huge companies, factories. You got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do that. And we resisted that because, ultimately, government directing what exactly each company should be doing and what industry should be doing, you can imagine that's not particularly something that we're fond of, in this administration. And frankly, most, I think, administrations would find that too heavy-handed, considering what the things we heard. We heard we were getting lots and lots of pressure to do more. So I think sticking, hearing from our conservative friends and others, and sticking to a light touch and a more surgical approach, a little bit here, one company here, one company there, limited amount of time. First, try to, go through just kind of voluntary negotiations before just jumping into the Defense Production Act. So those kinds of things have made our conservative allies happier for sure, and we hope it continues.
Okay, we've got Spencer Dorsey next. Spencer, you're up.
Okay, thanks for doing this.
Well, thanks.
So I know you've mentioned a few times that the White House is eager to leave kind of policymaking decisions to the states, but assuming that the White House had absolute authority already, just assuming that, would the model recommendations that you guys would set, would it be more of a Swedish model where we want to build up herd immunity over time? Or would it be more of a, if there's an outbreak anywhere, just shut it down for as long as it takes to get that under control? And either way that goes, it's obviously a pretty hard pill to swallow. So how do you pitch that to your allies politically? Thank you.
No, great question. And to be honest, let me slightly dodge it only because as a medical doctor, I mean, as not a medical doctor, as just a poli-sci doctor, which, what good is that doing me? But as not a medical doctor,
Hey.
as not a medical doctor, I'm not going to pretend to know, the medical benefits of one versus the other. In terms of what our medical advisors are telling us, what they have said is that the herd immunity may not necessarily be the way to go. They're not sure. It's not 100%. So, there's no, let me back up there. Sorry about that. These decisions are still being discussed as we speak by medical doctors, is what I'm trying to say. And so I don't want to preempt them. But I do think if you look at what our guidelines have been and what they still are, there is very much reliance on a lot of sheltering in place, protecting the vulnerable, teleworking, avoiding large groups, even when you reopen, not opening businesses that are built on crowds like bars. Like if you notice in our phase 1 reopening guidelines, we suggest no bars should be open because by their very nature, as we all know on this Zoom, they're meant to be crowded. So I think that's the administration's priority at this point, is following those guidelines, which themselves are built on more of the recommendations of sheltering in place, the quarantine type response, and less on the herd immunity stuff for now.
I've got Ash next.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us. My question is kind of more of a general point, but still relates a lot to the current coronavirus epidemic, in that I think that we can maybe agree that the Republican Party, in terms of its policy goals and stuff like that, and the conservative movement have gone through like a lot of changes in the past, years and decades. And kind of like, to what extent are political leaders of the Republican Party driving that change? And to what extent is it driven by more at like the grassroots movements where the people are the ones actually advocating for that change? So like, for example, like, I guess a big point of the conservative movement was that, large deficit spending is bad and we shouldn't be spending like a lot of federal government money. Whereas now it seems that a lot of people are pushing for bigger and bigger stimulus packages. For example, like this small business aid has been renewed twice and people want to renew it a third time. So how much of that is coming from the Republican leadership and how much of that is coming from the actual conservative, ordinary people?
Really good question. Very, very insightful stuff. I would say those changes over the years that you mentioned, much more grassroots driven. And I can speak to that, again, being, conservative liaison, not only just now, but it's kind of what I've always done, even when I was on Capitol Hill, still very much liaison to the, larger conservative movement, and it's very grassroots driven. Any, so-called conservative leader who doesn't have grassroots to back up his or her comments, statements, actions, whatever else, is not seen as credible as folks who are backed up. And those folks who do have grassroots very much need to rely and communicate and listen to and adhere to what they're saying, or they're not going to last very long. So yeah, it's very much grassroots driven. In terms of the spending point, look, great point. And what I'm hearing a lot, a very common refrain I'm hearing now is, okay, even for conservatives who voted for the recovery aid, our next step should be not necessarily spending focus, but economic growth focus. How do we grow the economy again, whether that be packages of, tax relief, deregulation, like we've talked about a few times, liability protection. That comes up a lot. You're going to hear that, if you haven't already, you're going to hear that more and more in the media. That's a huge topic of conversation right now, is to what extent should we protect reopening businesses, schools, churches, nonprofits, charity, whoever else, protect them from liability if they are responsibly reopening, if they're following state, local guidelines, if they're, doing from a sincere heart, doing what they believe is right, and following the guidelines. To what extent should their, liability be waived? It's interesting, and I'd love to, frankly, hear thoughts of folks on the Zoom, because that's a real hot topic now, and that all plays into what conservatives are asking for in the next, in that next package. How do you grow or regrow the economy if businesses are afraid to reopen, or if they're constantly being sued, or things along those lines? So it all plays in.
I don't think you're going to get liability waivers without a more IG oversight of the things. I suspect that's where your deal will be found.
Or another thing we're hearing for a deal is money directly to state coffers. Right. Not even for dealing with COVID, but just, hey, you got a big budget deficit, Mr. and Mrs. State government, here's some federal cash.
Is that the so-called blue state bailout that was referenced a couple weeks ago?
Right. You hear some about that. So yeah, that's right now what some are saying could be a trade for liability protections, but TBD. It's in the midst of it right now on Capitol Hill.
So I just want to push back on one thing you said about grassroots versus leader-led. I understand your point, particularly for those who don't have a media pulpit. That's certainly the case. But when I look at some of the Fox News personalities, or big radio, call-in radio personalities, they seem to have an ability to pivot on an issue pretty quickly, and then get their audience to follow with them. So they don't seem quite as beholden to the grassroots. They get to lead, in other words. Am I misreading it? I'm thinking of the Sean Hannitys of the world, Rush Limbaugh's.
Although, I would probably say that they get their impact from the fact that they have folks that listen, agree with, are moved by, what they say, right? Because if they didn't, even if they had fantastic ideas, but they weren't selling, you might not see them on TV as much. So,
but they got, on 1 week they got a large audience saying that the coronavirus was no worse than the flu, and then the president made some big changes, and the next week they were praising him for taking it seriously, and they were able to flip without losing audience share, at least the way it looked to me. I got another one here from Jonah, a question from Jonah. This might be a tough one, but batten down your hatches.
Yes, thank you for being here, Mr. Teller. You say that it's actually related to what Professor Feaver was just talking about, but you say that we didn't know that the coronavirus was bad, that it wouldn't be here so soon. And I fully believe that you personally didn't know. However, multiple Republican and Democratic senators, including North Carolina's own Richard Burr, sold stock when they knew our economy would be hit harshly. And the president certainly was hearing from numerous medical advisors that it was a big deal way earlier than your proposed timeline. To what extent do you hold these people responsible for their lack of communication, or do you think it was the right choice?
Well, you can imagine I will artfully dodge the stuff about the stock sales and those senators. Definitely don't want to comment on those. But on the timeline, I guess what I meant before was just that if you remember all of us going back, to January, I don't think if someone had said, stay home and don't leave your house in January, I don't know that a lot of people would have bought into that. We weren't there as a country yet. We were hearing, obviously, the advice from doctors, from other politicians come in. We were seeing what was going on around the world. And then, frankly, even if you remember, even when the president ordered some restrictions in travel, those were widely criticized, mainly left of center. So, even when there were some steps being taken, they were being kind of attacked as too much. And so I think that's maybe what I was, referring to before in terms of the timeline, that folks weren't ready for stricter steps back in January.
So let me ask one final question, and that is, this goes back to your point about a good point about the president's response was the way he allowed different states to go in different directions. And two questions about that. One is, do you think that devolving of power is going to persist, or will the inevitable centralization revive once we're out of the crisis? That's the first point.
Yeah.
And secondly, do you think it might even come back faster if it turns out that some of those bets were made horribly wrong, and you get, say Georgia, or pick a state that went in a different direction, and Florida, they begin to experience real problems in 2-3 months time, and then the pressure to federalize to rescue will be irresistible. So can you speak to those two issues?
I think that there could be some pressure like that. We're expecting that. I think, right, we're expecting some folks at some point to say, please, mama, federal government, help me out. And it's not to say there isn't some sort of role. Like I said, in everything we've rolled out, we have a federal role. It doesn't mean it's a zero role. It just means it isn't the first implementer. It's more the implementer of last resort, more of a final backstop if something at the state, local level, or private sector seems to not be working out. Frankly, even what I was saying about the Defense Production Act, right? We didn't just jump right into it. First, let's see, will people do it voluntarily? If not, can we have some negotiation? If not, okay, then you, as a backstop, last resort, you go to the Defense Production Act, things like that. Also, I think the way that we're seeing it, a lot of conservatives see it as well, is, state, when you have kind of diverse state actions, they're what's the phrase, laboratories of democracy, meaning, like any laboratory, you're doing tests, right? And some tests go well, some tests go not so well, and everything in between. And so we're monitoring that and expecting that as well, that there will be some state experiences that will be fantastic, and some maybe less so. And so we'll be working with everybody, but certainly working with the ones that feel they're not having as good of an experience, and seeing how we can help and pivot and go from there.
So I want to thank you again for coming. And if I were to summarize your job, I think, as I understand it, your job is to be yelled at by friends. That's sort of. You
know what? I'm going to use that. I haven't used it. It is, and it's friendly yelling, right? It's yelling out of caring and love, but it's.
But sometimes, after a long season of being yelled at by a friend, all you want to do is be hugged by a friend. And of course, in these days of social distancing, we're not allowed to hug. But we are allowed to do the next best thing, which is to put on an AGS t-shirt, which feels like a hug.
There we go.
From a friend. And so we're going to figure out a way to get you an AGS t-shirt, which is under the minimum guidelines that the federal government allows for these kinds of gifts. You can wear it as a hug the next time you get yelled at by your friends. But thank you for being such a good friend to Duke, and really countless Duke students you've helped get their initial launch in DC, and you're still doing it. Thank you, Paul, for what you're doing. Thank you for serving the country, and thank you for taking time out to come talk to us.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Great honor. Love staying in touch with Duke. It obviously breaks my heart that right now Duke is not Duke, right? Folks aren't there, and they're not at Myrtle or wherever else we talked about before, but we're confident Duke is going to come back. And, speaking of t-shirts, if someone wants to produce a shirt that says, like, Duke 2020, we would have won. That would be great. That would be great, right? I mean, like, you can see my little Duke display here, and it's a lot bigger than what you can see on camera, but I think we would have had a great tournament, and I'm really sorry we didn't get to see it. Right, especially Robinson, who was just coming into his own at the end. Oh my gosh, he would have been fantastic to watch in the tournament. So, what can you do? It'll make it all the more sweet next year.
Amen. Well, good to see you, and we are dismissed now. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Be in touch.